Hot on the heels of Black History Month, otherwise known as History, comes Black Comics Month, otherwise known as Comics. This doesn't mean that Frank Miller is drawing everything for a month. Apparently it means there are some sort of fixation and examination and celebration, supposedly, of black comics creators, writers, and all the rest of it. Now, I'd thought Black Comics Month was in the 90s, a period in which so much black ink was used that your comics arrived looking like they'd lost a fight with a giant squid. But no. Apparently the best way to overcome racism is to make everything pointedly about race, and to reduce comics artists, writers, letterers, colorists, and other people who work in comics, reduce them right down to the mere fact that they're not white. But hey, pointing that out is, well, racist, apparently, and that brings out the racist in large numbers to defend their racism, whatever colour they themselves happen to be. Go look at the tag and you'll see it's just full of awful, awful people of all creeds and colours. To paraphrase Martin Luther King, it shouldn't really matter a damn what colour you are, only whether you're a fucking jerk or not. With epic timing, it being Black Comics Month, the character Miles Morales, a version of Spider-Man from a side universe in the Marvel continuity, who happens to be a super person of colour and arachnid characteristics, was depicted as being a little disgusted at a YouTube show in which the revelation of the fact that he was of colour had excited the host a little too much. Miles here reflected an attitude that many comics readers seem to hold. He doesn't want to be Black Spider-Man, he just wants to be Spider-Man. Somehow, holding the opinion that race doesn't or shouldn't matter is in itself racist, and this was immediately blamed by the usual suspects of being down to a white writer, as well as being blamed on Gamergate, who, of course, were far too busy destroying Tokyo with their radioactive tweet breath at the time to have anything to do with it. This is a kind of exemplar of this whole fuss recently around reinventing characters, franchises and so on, just by throwing a bit of colour or gender or whatever onto it. It's a lazy way to make a pitch, and a cheap, facile, skin-deep surface way to include diversity without making too much of an effort. Why not come up with some new characters? It's not like this can't happen, and Blue Marvel is a great example. Even though I felt that the premise didn't quite carry through as far as it could have. You know, in dealing with history and the whole civil rights movement and everything, a lot more could have been done with that character. But it was encouraging. You know, it was a true character grounded in that world and everything, and it wasn't just a cheap knockoff. It wasn't She-Thor. This shit doesn't, or at least shouldn't, matter, and lighting it up like a great big Christmas tree only prolongs and encourages the idea of seeing the races as somehow being inherently different or having special racial characteristics that individuate them from everybody else. In other words, it encourages racism, which is the exact opposite of what it's intended to do. Besides, what's really important here is that Spider-Man is a menace, and we here at the Daily Bugle intend to take him down. A similar round of bullshit hit the horror genre this week as well, with the Borderlands anthology coming under attack for apparently not being diverse enough in the people that it includes. Now, this was quite reasonably answered by Tom Monteleone, in that he said, yeah, I don't care about any of this. He said, all I see is black ink on white paper, which is a perfectly reasonable way to look at it. You know, when you're reading a book, you don't know pretty much anything about the person that's written it, so you just judge the words that are there. That seems like a perfectly reasonable way to go about things, and it seems like a good way to go about things, to eliminate everything but the writing. That sounds like a perfect solution to any biases that anyone might have. That's not the way other people see it, though. They apparently want to be reduced down to their race, gender, sexuality, or other irrelevant characteristics, maybe hair colour. Is there a gingers-only anthology? Who knows? But they'd rather be known as that, and thought of in that way, rather than be known and thought of for their talent. I know I'd likely be quite offended if the only reason I were given work was down to something that had nothing to do with any of my writing. This whole affair puts me in mind of that poet, Michael Derrick Hudson, last year. Couldn't get his poetry published for love nor money, until he took on the pen name Yi Fen Chu, and then, suddenly, as a minority, the offers came rushing in. That's not a good way to go about things. But it underlined the bias, and the bias is going the opposite way to you might think. I've half a mind to start using the Tamil name Polipayar, which means fake name, and let's see how far I could get with that. Horror, though. if you're not looking to offend or upset someone, then horror may not be the genre for you. It's inherently transgressive, and the whole intent of a horror book is to trigger you. I can't really see Jason Voorhees asking for affirmative consent before he plunges his machete into you. Striving for inoffensiveness in horror is like trying to sell a roller coaster on the fact it has lots of flat, long, slow sections. Fair enough if that tickles you, but other people, they like the loops and the drops. No Man's Sky, or Computer Game Jesus, now has a release date sometime in June. This is the procedurally generated god of games, apparently. It's going to have absolutely everything, an enormous universe, procedurally generated everything. If you're a tech head and you love things like Elite and so on, it looks amazing. So the fact that there is a release date has caused mass ejaculations across the land, as everyone now has a date they can finally look forward to when they can jizz about it. Of course, on the other hand, Uncharted has been delayed. So while the game gods giveth with one hand, they take away with the other. Nintendo's a bit under fire this week, and has been for quite a while. Some of this has been over localization and regionalization and so on, which has become a code word for massive censorship. And this attitude towards localization and regionalization, making it censored, this has led to a rather combative attitude amongst Nintendo fans, especially fans of imported Japanese games, which tend to be a bit more risque and fast and loose with sexuality and so on than a lot of Western games are. So it turns out that one of Nintendo's representatives at Treehouse, Alison Rapp, is something of a paedophile apologist. The details are a bit hazy, a bit fuzzy, but there's Twitter comments from her that seem to be excusing it. There's a paper she wrote that seems to be excusing it. And yet at the same time she's justifying censorship in local arenas. So paedophilia is okay, but censoring sexual content is also okay. There's a dissonance there. And to be clear, we don't seem to be talking about lolly, which personally I would protect, though it's not to my taste, as being free expression. Nobody's getting hurt, nobody's getting exploited. Let the pervs have their drawings. But this seems to be something more, and there's a broader context to consider here, in that Nintendo has this hugely family-friendly image that they want to maintain. And personally, I think her personal comments should be taken separately from her professional comments. Everyone's entitled to a private life, and this academic paper, pseudo-academic paper, that she wrote within academia, that's its own context, and we should be unafraid to examine things. But it's not hard to see why people are upset with her, And while the DS gives you the chance to fiddle about with things on two screens, it seems that while you're fiddling about on two screens, Nintendo might be willing to let someone fiddle with your kids off screen. Either way, it's a huge fucking mess. It's not clear whether she's being fired or what, and it's even hit the newspapers. And this is all part of the same bundle. Just translate games, leave them alone. The rest of this, I don't know. It's a big mess. And we deserve private lives, but it's understandable why fans are upset. It's understandable why a lot of mileage is being taken out of this, and the whole situation's a huge clusterfuck. Hopefully an of-age clusterfuck. Okay, stop me if you've heard this one. 4 grotesque stereotypes, a focus group, and a blatant ideological agenda walk into a much-loved franchise. There's no punchline, rather like the Ghostbusters trailer. So yeah, that happened. The Ghostbusters trailer dropped, or Ghostbustugh, as I'm going to call it from now on. And that was just painful. I'd actually been holding out hope for a while that it might be good against all the odds. I tried to reserve some judgment and only really comment and bitch about the dramatic clusterfuck that sprung up around it. But no, if that trailer contains the best jokes from the whole thing, then it's an unfunny crapfest that proves once again that CGI is no substitute for heart, jokes, or talent. It looks like pixels with tits. But there's the problem though, you're not allowed to be upset at it because apparently that's sexist. And there couldn't possibly be any other reason that you're upset with it. There couldn't possibly be any other reason than sexism why you might be upset at a completely unnecessary rehash of a much-loved film that's been made into a gender politics football. No, it can't be the CGI or the shitty jokes or the sophomoric tone it's taken on. It must be because you hate women. But then the Sockjust crowd is upset with it as well because they find the racial depiction offensive. And honestly, I have to agree. I mean, I love a good ectoplasmic ghost bukkake scene as much as the next guy, but playing it for laughs, culturally insensitive to the Japanese. And if you haven't read what the Japanese said to you and calls for censorship of their media, I suggest you go and read that, because that's far funnier than the Ghostbusters trailer. I mean, we're talking here about a film that isn't even out yet, but which is already causing cancer. Too offensive for you? Well, it's fortunate for me that I do not live in Canada. Because in Canada, that kind of thing can get you taken to court. They've got comedian Mark Ward up before a human rights tribunal for making a joke years ago at the expense of a disabled kid who was sent to the Vatican to sing for the Pope. The whole joke being a vehicle for mocking the Pope and the heartstring-tugging vulture media that surrounds these kind of events. This, coming hot on the heels of the Greg Elliott trial for mean tweets, well, that's the only funny thing here. Canada's attitude to a genuinely recognised international human right, free expression. And that was the geek that was. Peace out.